Trade Investment Partnership and Public Health. The devil is in the detail. Before I make introductions, just a few domestics. Housekeeping, fire exits back there, over there. There's not going to be a fire alarm test, so if it does ring, one alarm and broken ring, that's the time to leave the building. So leave the room in an orderly manner, by March fire exits, go downstairs, and we assemble at the corner of Eaton Place in Edmund Street. Toilets, go through the exit over that side, follow the round to the left, and you'll see ladies' toilets. Mobile phones, please put them on silent. Unite West Midlands are kindly offered to stream the meeting live on their YouTube channel, so if you know anyone who'd like to be here, you can make it. You can text, tweet, or Facebook them by the link. Is it there? Yes, there you go. There's the link. And if you're tweeting, the hashtags we're using for the event are no TTIP run, and the broader quantity hashtag is no TTIP. So we're here to aim to broaden the debate on TTIP and have a discussion on the potential impact of the deal with expert input from our speakers. First of all, I'll introduce myself. I'm Rosie Edwards, I'm the chair, and I'm also the non-executive director at an NHS trust. So, speaker introduction. Following there is Dr. Gabriel Siles-Brugge, lecturer in politics at Manchester University. He's giving evidence in business to the Department of Business Innovation and Skills Select Committee Inquiry on TTIP. He's an established author, the latest publication being TTIP, The Truth About the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership, which is obviously going to be useful reading. Got next to him John Hilary, Executive Director of War and Want. This is a major campaign organisation against TTIP in the UK, but we also work with other organisations. He's been in Birmingham a few times, campaigning on TTIP and other things, including Palestine. We were going to have Jess Phillips, MP for Birmingham Yardley, but she's unable to come because she is ill. So we've got Martin Straight-Wells. He's a councillor for Moseley. He's been campaigning locally on TTIP. He'll tell us a bit about what he would like the council to do and what he's been doing as a campaigner. Then we've got Gerard Coyne, Regional Secretary of Unite the Union West Midlands. Unite is supporting this event tonight. They've been campaigning extensively against the privatisation of the health service, and they're in a good place to discuss the impact this trade deal would have on workers' rights. Now, we did actually want to have the detail, the devil in the detail, and have input from all sides. So we did invite representation from the government. So Saeed Javid, MP for Bromsgrove, Secretary of State for Business Innovation and Skill, position, who was invited to give his stance on the potential impact of TTIP on business, but he didn't respond, I understand. Then Jeremy Light, QC, MP for Kenilworth, the Attorney General, he was invited to give his stance on the potential legal challenges to the UK under the investor-state dispute settlement provisions of the TTIP deal, which we'll go into in a bit more detail from the speakers, because he was in a good place to talk about the legal implications, but he was unavailable. They didn't suggest any alternative spokespeople from the government, so I'm afraid we haven't got government representation. But we do have a conference pack, we should have it. We like conference packs. And we hope you find it interesting. It includes the stances of organisations and individuals represented on the panel, so there's more information about them. You'll also note there's a long response from a Conservative MEP, that's Andrea McIntyre. I wrote to her, it's a really long response from her. And it's a fairly standard set of the government line on things. And Gabriel's been asked to touch on some of the things that they've said in response. And we'll have questions to answer in finer detail if you want to cover that. Now, the purpose for you coming here is obviously for you to find out more. We hope that you'll be able to use this app and spread the information you get in this meeting to others. One of the main things that we're trying to do on TTIP is shine a light on it. Because for so long it's been done in secret, so the purpose of this is to say, look at it, let's have a look at what it means to us. So I hope you find this informative, and that both the speakers and the questions and the answers that you get will help you to understand more about it and be able to talk more effectively to others when you need them. So move over to the first speaker, which is Gabriel.
Right, so I've been told to speak for 10 minutes, which I think John once said, speak without footnotes. I'll try and avoid that as an academic and we're prone to use. So it's great to see a fantastic attendance here. It's a Thursday night. We've got over 100 people, it seems. Here to listen to an academic from another city talk about a trade agreement, which is something which I never imagined in my wildest dreams when I was writing my PhD about EU trade agreements would happen. So that's fantastic. So what I want to do with my 10 minutes is I want to give you a little bit of an overview of the book that Rosie so kindly mentioned. And thank you very much for sharing with me, Rosie, and Sarah and Alex from People's Save Our NHS West Midlands for inviting me. And essentially what we do in the book is, apart from spelling out what TTIP is two things. One, we try and sort of unpick some of the narratives that are put forward by politicians in favor of the agreement. That is to say that this agreement is going to generate vast amounts of growth and jobs, and that this agreement is going to allow the EU and the US to set the standards of the global economy for the future. So we try and unpick those, and I'll give you a very brief sort of summation of those arguments tonight. In the Q&A, maybe we can draw those out. And the second thing we do is we sort of ask, well, TTIP isn't about those two things, and what is it about? And our conclusion is that this is about entrenching, a form of deregulatory politics that is in some ways quite subtle, and that's why it's very important to challenge it. So, what is TTIP? So, you may or may not have heard about this, and you're packed into a lot of information about it, but essentially what this is a so-called free trade agreement, right? And so the idea is to eliminate existing barriers to trade between the United States and the European Union. And as it happens, most of the barriers to trade between the United States and the European Union are not things called tariffs, right? Taxes on imports, apart from a few areas. They're in differences in the way that the EU and the US regulate product standards, so things like car safety standards, the safety standards for chemicals, pharmaceuticals, environmental standards. And so the logic of the agreement is, we need to try and eliminate those barriers because they're preventing our firms from exporting to each other, and as a result, goods are more expensive, and consumers lose out, etc. It's more efficient if we eliminate those barriers to trade. What TTIP also contains is the intention is to have provisions on a series of rules for the way in which economies should be regulated, including a series of provisions on investment protection. This is, of course, where much of the controversy is focused on, which is the degree to which those investment protections can be enforced by so-called investment arbitration tribunals, and that's something I'll touch upon a little bit later as well. So, as you'll have guessed, and it's quite clear in the Andrea McIntyre email that's in your packs, there's two ways in which TTIP is sold, or why TTIP is seen as something important. The first is that, the argument is that this is the cheapest stimulus package you can imagine, to quote Carol Good, who made these remarks back in 2013, but the logic still applies. The argument is made that TTIP is a way of generating growth for free. And so I think Andrea McIntyre refers to these statistics that were generated by a commission paid for study, when she says that TTIP will generate an extra £400 per family of four in the UK. And I think in the EU it would be 545 per EU family, right? So the statistics are roughly equivalent. Which, if you think about it, actually, if you drill down, it's not that much anyway. I think it was Lynn Moody who said that that's an extra cup of coffee per person per week, right? So, of course, it's nice to have an extra cup of coffee, especially if it's a good one, but it doesn't amount to much. And moreover, those statistics are suspect, and this is some of the research I did with a colleague, because they're based on an econometric model which is quite optimistic about the degree to which trade liberalization can take place, and it also exaggerates the degree to which regulatory barriers actually pose a burden on business, right? So, most estimates would put that burden at an extra 3%, which is less than currency fluctuations. So it's not very much, actually, that can be gained from eliminating those barriers. And actually, potentially, a lot could be lost because those differences in regulation arise from different regulatory cultures. And it's not to say that the EU is always more stringent in terms of its standards in the United States, and things like financial services, the United States has more stringent standards. But the point is, if you eliminate those barriers, potentially what you could be doing is going towards lower standards, right? And that's sort of a social cost that's not factored into the econometric calculation. So that's the first thing. The second thing is this argument that's often put forward on TTIP, which is that this is a way to set the standards of the global economy, right? Before China does, right? And China, of course, cares a lot less about welfare standards for animals or labor rights than the United States or the EU. So, of course, that means that we need to make sure we come together with a like-minded partner and we set the standard before China does. And the logic of that argument is flawed because the way in which TTIP is set up is that it's largely about just mutually recognizing standards on both sides of the Atlantic. And mutual recognition means that you say that your standards are equivalent in a particular area and you accept potentially also the certification of those standards standards by an outside body. And of course, you know, when you have that, a very limited form of what you call regulatory alignment, there's little incentive for third parties to adopt your standards and for you to become a global standard setter, because you're just recognizing each other's standards. So exporters from third parties have very little interest in adopting your standards. And so, you know, not only that, but, you know, mutual recognition, of course, has a sort of deregulatory dynamic to it, because, of course, it means that if the standards are not equivalent, then, of course, you're going towards the lower standard, and the lower standard becomes acceptable. Right? So this global standards argument is flawed because what's being proposed is very limited mutual recognition to an extent. So, the question then, you know, you might ask is, if it's not about growth of jobs, if it's not about setting global standards, you know, what is it about? And here, you know, there's been much fanfare about the NHS, and this is an issue that's of course important, but what I would say is that TTIP is about, in a sense, entrenching a particular form of regulatory quality. And what it's about is about, you know, throwing a spanner in the works of potential regulation that is an irritant to business. It's about changing the debate about regulation, or further entrenching the view that regulation, because of course this is already a view that's sort of held in government and in the European Commission, but further entrenching that view that regulation is an irritant to free exchange and an irritant to the free market, and that as a result, you know, we should do as little as possible of it. And there's two dynamics here. One is the so-called, two aspects of this. One is the so-called investor state dispute settlement mechanism, which is a mechanism whereby investors, foreign investors I should add, can take governments or can pursue claims against governments if they feel that their investor rights have been violated. And the way in which this is defined is often very broad, so that all manner of public policy decisions, from plain packaging to minimum wage laws, have been challenged in these tribunals in the past. And the Commission, I think it was yesterday, came up with a series of reform proposals to make the system less egregious. And of course, they are improvements on the existing system, but they still don't address the underlying thing, which is that investors still have recourse to a mechanism that no one else has recourse to challenge government decisions. And that, of course, apart from the fact that, you know, investors are generally well protected in the United States and the European Union, you know, it potentially undermines regulatory decision making, because governments may be inclined, may be less likely inclined to take regulatory decisions if they can be challenged in these tribunals. The second thing, this is perhaps the heart of TTIP, and this gets lost, I think, sometimes in the public debate, is that TTIP, the idea is for TTIP to become a living agreement, which is to say that, you know, even if not much is agreed in TTIP, there's a proposal to have a horizontal chapter on regulation, which would sort of institute processes which may themselves also have a chilling effect on regulation. And this would be in two forms. One, it's about making sure that, or the proposal the EU has put forward for this chapter is to entrench this thing called regulatory coherence, and that's all about making sure that regulation is subject to proper impact assessment from a competitiveness logic point of view, right? So it's not about assessing the social environmental impact so much, it's more about assessing, oh well, how detrimental is this to the cost of doing business. It's about involving stakeholders more in the consultation. Of course, stakeholders in this case is largely business. And it's about ensuring accountability, but accountability here means justifying your measures in terms of a very narrow competitiveness economic logic, right? Rather than saying this regulation is good at protecting the environment, the way you justify the regulation is by saying, you know, this is not too costly for business. And then secondly, it's also about encouraging more greater regulatory cooperation between the EU and the US, and establishing a mechanism where the EU and the US can query each other's regulation, right? So, you know, this in itself also introduces a dynamic where, of course, the other party may have an interest in pushing the other party in a particular direction, right? And it's not just the US pushing the EU, it goes the other way around. Right? You know, the EU probably not want more onerous regulation on financial services for a variety of reasons. So, you know, most importantly, I mean, and this is the thing to stress about TTIP, and this is the, you know, and responding to people who say, well, this is undermining democracy because parliaments would still have to say over regulation. I mean, this sort of stuff intervenes at the sort of agenda-setting stage, right? You know, it throws a spanner in the works early, right? So the proposals don't even get out, as it were, or delayed. There's already evidence of this occurring in the context of TTIP. And this is already dovetailing quite nicely with the UK government's deregulation agenda, but also the European Union's wider deregulation agenda, the so-called better regulation plan. So it really, in some ways, is subtle, but it's still a sort of, you know, potentially quite nefarious process. So, by way of conclusion, I've got 10 seconds, but hopefully Rosie can bear with me for a little bit longer than 10 seconds. You know, I think I was asked to conclude on what a good TTIP would look like, and you know, a good TTIP would be an agreement that leveled up, right? That led to, you know, harmonization of standards, potentially a potentially at a higher level than they exist now. But that's certainly not the dynamic that we're seeing now that myself and my colleague would point to. And I think, given the context of the trade agreement, of course it's something to push for, but I think that would be very difficult to achieve. So as it stands, I think TTIP is something quite problematic. I look forward to your questions.
And now, John, please speak for 10 minutes.
Thank you so much, Rosie. It's great to be here. I'm very proud to be standing on the Unite platform as a long-standing Unite member myself, and formerly even a shop steward and staff member of Transport and Work Team. So thank you very much for having me here. And it's great because I think we're amongst friends, and therefore, as well as the content of TTIP, I want to talk a little bit about politics. And talking about politics is always good to be amongst friends, because otherwise you're going to be great fights. So really, for us, the politics of TTIP breaks down into three main pillars. And this is really where I think we can begin to grasp what the whole agreement is about. The European Union and the USA meeting behind closed doors with absolutely no oversight, no transparency, in order to achieve three main things. The first of this, which Gabriel has already touched on a bit, is deregulation. The idea that corporations want to get rid of all of the standards and the rules and the regulations which prevent them from maximising their profit. That's what they've said right from the beginning. TTIP is about getting rid of the rules and regulations that stand in the way of profit. We thought at the beginning, what are they talking about? What do they mean when they talk about rules and regulations? And they made it clear. They made a big list for us, which was handy. They started, labour standards. Of course you want to get rid of labour standards. Of course you want to get rid of workers' rights. In the States, they don't even have a statutory right to holiday pay, let alone maternity pay and things like that. So getting rid of labour standards, getting rid of environmental standards, public health standards, food safety standards. Did you know 70% of all processed food in the USA in supermarkets contains genetically modified ingredients? And people in Europe said, we don't want to eat GM food, and therefore we have a right to be able to say no. Under TTIP, the US government is saying, you don't get to choose. TTIP is about free trade, not your freedom to choose. It's the freedom of corporations to be able to trade and invest without having to pay attention to the regulations that we hold to be important. So deregulation is the key political imperative right at the heart of TTIP. The second pillar is privatisation. And privatisation is basically the private sector looking out across the markets and saying there are areas where still, in the 21st century, we haven't managed to get our hands on. And particularly looking at public services, which we consider to be rather important to keep away from the market. Health, education, water, wastewater, rail, road, financial services, housing, all of these are in TTIP. All of those sectors are included within TTIP. And you might say to people, yeah, actually, when you think of it, we're a bit late in the game with that one, because unless you've been completely asleep for a long time, you'll have noticed that the Tories, and indeed the Labour Party and the Blair, has successively privatised pretty much all of those things in Britain. Think of the Health and Social Care Act 2012, which got rid of the last bastion, the NHS, opening it up so now up and down the country, frontline NHS services are provided by Richard Branson, and not by the NHS. But the key thing about these trade deals, about TTIP and all of the other trade deals which include public services, is this. Once you put a privatised public service inside a trade deal, the idea is you don't get it back again. So you can have any number of pledges made by future political party to come into power and to reverse the privatisation. Once it's in a trade deal, the idea is you've guaranteed to US corporations that they will have permanent access, permanent control of those markets. So it's locking it in, and what they say is effectively irreversible. So privatisation forever is the second pillar. And the third pillar is this extraordinary transfer of power from ordinary working people to corporations, from labour to capital, from society to big business. And that comes through these new corporate courts, this new system which will be available for US corporations alone. No people get access to it, no domestic firms get access to it, no governments get access to it. Only the corporations get access to it. So they can sue any future government for loss of profits, not loss of contracts. You know, if I take out, if I'm a US company and I have a contract with Birmingham City Council for collecting bins, and Birmingham City Council wakes up one morning and says, we don't want to, give you that contract anymore, I have every right to go to the open court system and try and get compensation. This isn't about contracts. This isn't about loss of something you've already signed up to. This is saying in the future, your desire to make profits has to be upheld by the government. The legitimate expectations is what they refer to. I have a legitimate expectation that I'm going to make £250 million out of this contract in the future, and that's what you sue back. And that's where you get situations like the government of Germany now being sued by a Swedish company for €5 billion for deciding it doesn't want to be involved in nuclear power after the year 2022. It's where you get Philip Morris suing the government of Australia for billions of dollars and threatening to do the same to Britain for requiring all cigarettes to be packaged in plain packaging. It's where you get Veolia, who we already hate because of their presence in Palestine, suing the government of Egypt for daring to raise the minimum wage. These things are not made up, these are happening right now, and TTIP will bring that to our shores. Now, those are sort of the basic principles of what's the political agenda behind it. I've also been asked to sort of give an update of where we are now. The negotiations started in 2013, and their original plan would be to finish them by the end of this year. A lot of resistance has gone on, which has said they're not going to be able to do that, so they've admitted they're not going to be finishing them this year, but they're still hoping to finish them before the end of President Obama's presidency, i.e. the end of next year, which is why this next 12-month period is absolutely key for our campaign. In July, the European Parliament got a vote on this. Not their final vote, because that's well off in the distance, but the first vote for the current Parliament to be able to take a position on TTIP. And it was a good moment for us to really crank up the campaign underneath them, and particularly for the Labour MEPs, who up until now have always said they will vote for TTIP. They always said, we will not vote against TTIP. We believe that this is something we should be doing, even though all of the official statistics, not ours, the official statistics, say that at least 1 million people will lose their jobs as a direct result of TTIP. Anyway, that's bygones be bygones. The Labour Party said at that time we will vote for it. But we had so much pressure on them that the Labour MEPs were forced to vote down, well, to vote against the pro-TTIP resolution. Unfortunately, the German Social Democrats and the Italians all voted for it, so it passed. But it's now, therefore, gone back into the system. The EU and the US have met again in the 10th round, and then in a couple of weeks' time they'll be meeting in Miami for the 11th round of talks, and they'll be trying to tie them up. But politically, we have a new situation. As you may or may not have noticed, there is a new leadership in the Labour Party as of last weekend, and one of the first things that the Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, and indeed, last night on Channel 4 News, the new Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, said is that we don't want TTIP. So suddenly we're in that interesting position where you have a leadership of a party holding a different position from the stated manifesto position of the party. The Labour manifesto said, in principle, we are totally in favour of TTIP. We want to get the NHS a bit protected, but we're in favour of it. So we're in interesting times in that respect. So I want to just finish by talking a little bit about the campaign, because that's also what I've been asked to do. We have built a fantastic campaign in this country, and one of the great strengths of it is that it reaches across a whole range of different types of organisations. We've got the green groups, we've got more on the campaigns groups, we've got digital rights groups, and we've got all of the groups trying to save the NHS. But really importantly, we have the entire trade union movement. And all of the trade unions have signed up absolutely squarely, not to take bits out of TTIP, but in full opposition to it. And as of September last year, in the last TUC Congress, there was a motion which committed the entire of of the British Labour movement against TTIP. And that is really fantastic. Next week, the European Trade Union Confederation is holding its 4-yearly summit, they're meeting every 4 years, in Paris. And I'm afraid that ETUC, despite the fact that all of the national federations of trade unions across the whole of Europe, except for Scandinavia, have all come out saying no TTIP. The ETUC is refusing to take that. So literally 2 days ago, the representative of the ETUC was down in Brighton at the current TUC Congress and actually being heckled by other trade unionists saying, how is it possible that you are not taking this position? And it's important because the Labour MEPs, when they stand up in Brussels or in Strasbourg, they can turn around and say, why should we be against it? The ETUC, which represents all working people across Europe, is not against it. So we've still got a job to do there to make sure that all of our representatives, all the way up through the trade union movements, will say no. But we've also been working across other movements as well. I hope that a lot of people here have already signed the European Citizens Initiative against TTIP and CETA. Would you put your hand up if you have signed the European Citizens Initiative against TTIP? Well, there are some people who haven't, so just as well, I've brought some sheets for people to sign up on here. This is something where we have already got close to 3 million signatories from across Europe, the biggest ever initiative that's taken place, and we're about to close it for this first year on the 6th of October, which is 2 weeks away, which is why I need people to sign up tonight, and I'll take it back to London with me. But the final thing to say on this, there is absolutely no way that the powers of Europe are going to suddenly wake up one morning and decide that they've made a terrible mistake over TTIP. They have committed themselves to forcing through this deal in the face of mass public opposition. I met with the European Trade Commission, we had a private meeting in February of this year in her office in Brussels, and I said to her, you are aware, aren't you, that the whole of the people of Europe are against you in this? And she just said to me, I will take my mandate from the European people. And it's that level of arrogance that we have to find out. But the good news is, TTIP is so rotten across so many different areas that it's brought together a mass movement across all of Europe to defeat it. We've defeated these things before. Every time they've tried to bring in these powers for corporations, we have fought back and we have won. And this time we will win again because we absolutely cannot afford to lose. This is a battle for our future. Do you want a future where everything you fought for is put in hock to big business, to transnational capital? Or do you want a future where you can actually look to higher values, labour rights, workers' rights, food safety, public health, all the things that we hold dear? And that's the choice that we're fighting for, and that's why we must defeat TTIP. Thank you so much.
I'm here because Jess isn't. And it's a privilege and a pleasure to be standing here in place of, as representative of, formidable and feisty Labour member, VRE, Jess Phillips. I hope she's better soon, and I hope she's in her rude health, but I'm delighted to be here representing, if you like, her interests. There is a connection, by the way, because Jess is actually a member of our branch, and there's no earthly reason why you should know what the branch is, but I'm going to tell you. The branch is the Moseley and Kings Heath branch of the Labour Party. And Jess is, as I said, a member. We have been very much involved in campaigning about TTIP. Don't ask me to say the words. TTIP is easy. Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership isn't, but it is. And last Thursday, we actually, and some of our members are actually here, which is rather reassuring, but last Thursday, we passed a motion at our branch meeting about TTIP. And I'm going to read it to you, because it tells me something about what I've got to do as a city councillor, and also something about what the City Council perhaps has to do as part of the whole business of trying to look after the four big concepts that are coming through from the other speakers. We're talking about regulation, rights, responsibilities, and indeed entitlement. So bear with me while I just read the resolution, which is a bit of a historic resolution that was passed at that branch last Thursday. And I'll try not to follow the words. This branch views with deep suspicion the current negotiations on the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP. In particular, the potential for it to lead to reduction in standards of protection for citizens and the environment. We are also concerned about the impact of investor-state dispute settlements on policymaking. Now, this is the emphasis. We call upon the Albury Constituency Labour Party to put forward our concerns to the National Executive Committee, our members of the European Parliament, our Member of Parliament, and the Shadow Minister for Europe. We also call upon our councillors to work with their fellow councillors to consider the impact that TTIP may have on the people of Birmingham and to take appropriate action. Now, this is something that's getting deeper and deeper into the consciousness of individuals throughout the country, thanks to Radio 4 and John Humphreys and folk like that who've been interviewing folk about what it actually means. So a year ago, when I hardly knew anything about TTIP, nothing at all in fact, if I'm totally honest, after a year, I'm beginning to feel that I understand a little bit about what it means. But what we've been doing over a period of time, in fact, pretty much over about 6 months to a year, we have actually been trying to take some action in order to make sure that we not only school ourselves about what it means as a person, but also to get the general public involved. So we have stood outside Asda in King's Heath on freezing cold days, numbed with chilled cold, giving out information to people. Initially, on my part, rather nervously, because I would wave something as a leaflet in the air saying TTIP, and people would walk by. But if you actually said to them, do you know what TTIP is going to do for your health service? They would stop and listen. Do you know what TTIP might do to your other services, your standards of food, your standards of hygiene? Do you know the things you take for granted because those standards are there in legislation and are there to protect your interests? Do you know what would happen if standards of the environment were lessened? And they begin to start taking measures. So we know from experience that campaigning and taking this issue to the public can actually trigger a response. And that is what we've been doing. And we've actually been taking part in the city centre as well. I mean, one of the things, I'm interested in education, that's my passion. And I remember we were, I think, at the Harvard Festival, and there was a stall on TTIP, and there were a group of teachers there. It hadn't occurred to me at the time that education itself could become one of these feeding troughs for the vampires if they decide, and privatisation, by the way, is no joke, and it's happening. And I'm reminded by Gerard, every time I hear him, and more recently, by the speakers, privatisation seems to be the answer to everything in terms of this government's own ideology. Well, it isn't. And as somebody who's in public service, to protect public services, it is very, very worrying. So I would say the big hook is the NHS, but there are other equally big hooks. What's at stake? Now, again, this government seems to feel that regulation is a dirty word. It isn't. Regulation in the interests of the public has got to be a good thing, particularly if it regulates standards. And I'm very glad to hear, and I think it's still true, that in July, Labour members of Parliament are not going to accept anything that endangers public services. Hope that continues. Because regulation is not just about red tape, it's about workers' rights, it's about food safety, and it's about all the standards that we come to take for granted. The most insidious thing, it seems to be, well, perhaps not the most insidious, one of the most insidious things about TTIP, is that companies can bypass countries and use private tribunals to sue governments if they enact legislation to protect people or the environment at the expense of corporate profit. But that's what they've been elected to do. That's precisely what they've been elected to do, to protect the environment, to protect people, to look after their interests. So, is this what the governments are for? The answer is, of course, a resounding no. And thank goodness for the election of a new leader of the Labour Party, who seems to want and is being successful in conveying to everybody in the public out there that actually decency matters, standards matter, and also having values matter. So where I would want to present myself is as what I call a campaigning counsellor, somebody who believes that these things must be protected because they're important. Public services must be protected because they're important. So finally, about public services. Well, if privatisation carries on as it currently is doing, then there aren't any public services that are off limits. And so you would have to say public services or private profit, because that is what the story is about. And so what I would urge everybody to do, and what I'm going to do, is to commit myself to campaigning, not only outside Asda and King's, not only in the Moses City Centre, not only in the city centre, but I shall also be campaigning to make sure that my council takes this issue as seriously as I've learned to come to do over the last year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin, and particularly thank you for stepping in the last minute to put that speech together. Really good. And now Gerard, please.
Thanks very much, Rosie. One of the difficulties of being the last speaker is that everybody else has said everything that you wanted to say in the first instance anyway. Firstly, can I thank and congratulate the People's NHS and Rosie acting as the chair this evening for putting together tonight's event. I'm really genuinely very pleased with the turnout and the level of interest we've had from members and the broader family of the Labour movement in engaging in this discussion and debate tonight. Not just people sat here in the auditorium, but also those engaged via Twitter and social media. So, this is exactly what has to happen. The message does have to get out there about what TTIP is about. And I found myself reflecting, thinking before this evening about actually this week we've celebrated or remembered the 75th anniversary of the Battle of Britain. And this is something which holds quite an enormous significance for this city. So my mic's dipping in and out there. Playing with the mics. It holds a significance for this city, not just because of the heavy bombings that Birmingham endured, but also because of the iconic Spitfire that was built just down the road in Castle Bromwich. So Birmingham has a really rich history of fighting tyranny and standing up for democracy. However, democratic principles which people in this city laid down their lives for are now genuinely under threat as a result of the stealth which is TTIP. In fact, almost to rework a quote that you may have heard quite a bit this week, never has so much been given up by so few to the detriment of so many. I don't need to tell you that is exactly what is happening with TTIP at the moment. This virtually secret trade and regulatory negotiations between the EU and the US is taking place without the public scrutiny which should be upon it. If I may, I'd like to quote to you a little passage from the statement that was issued following the July round of negotiations. And this quote is from an Ignacio Garcia Becerra, And I genuinely do apologise if I mispronounce his name, but actually I never heard it reported ever before, and I'm pretty sure that none of you in this room, maybe with the exception of some of the academics on the panel, have never heard of him before. But it may shock you to know that he is the EU's lead negotiator in TTIP. He's not elected, he's not democratically accountable, he is a bureaucrat of the highest order, and he's the chief negotiator on TTIP. And in this two-page summary, quite literally, of a week's negotiations that took place in July, I found a really fascinating quote. And literally, from that two-page summary, a paragraph, a key component of TTIP is for us is sustainable development. This has not been on our agenda this week, simply because we are currently finalising an ambitious proposal which goes beyond what we have done in any of our precedent agreements. We aim at presenting a proposal to our US colleagues in September. That proposal will then be made public. The proposal will then be made public for such a significant issue as climate change. The negotiations are taking place between the EU and the US on the proposals that are worked up in secret without any public scrutiny whatsoever. Does not public scrutiny, openness and transparency bear the whole genuine hallmarks of a true democracy? But I'm sad to say how much of this process has actually been conducted in secret without public scrutiny. In Unite, we don't believe that this is about a genuine trade agreement, as already tariffs between the EU and the US are comparatively low. This is about liberalising markets and opening up competition and yet more privatisation. And of course, we have targeted and made sure that the general public is aware of the impact on the NHS, and quite understandably, because thus far, if you try to say TTIP and discuss the issues and the concerns that we have, it doesn't quite strike the resonance that you would like it to. If you explain to people that it's going to lead to privatisation in the NHS, then people start to prick up their ears and listen. Our campaign in terms of our involvement about drawing to attention the public's interest in the NHS and the impact TTIP will have is significant and needs to continue. Our NHS, the NHS that was born out of the rubble of the Second World War, that is probably our greatest national asset, is now under threat. And we have to have the ability to choose how those services are delivered. In this statement that was issued in July, the EU tried to calm some of the nerves because clearly the pressure is starting to work. They stated that TTIP will fully preserve the right of public authorities to choose the manner in which they deliver and run the public services offered to their citizens. But as the title of tonight's meeting suggests, we all know the devil is in the detail. And of course they will not determine how we deliver and run public services, but they will determine the framework when it is put out to competition or put out to tender. And that's the critical bit. And why do we know this? Because we've been here before. We've been here in CCT and compulsory competitive tendering. Through CCT, companies like Sodexo, Serco, EDF, and many others have become household names who bring up public contracts and utilities right across this country. And in the process of doing that, through the process of CCT, they have driven down workers' terms and conditions, they have attacked health and safety, and they have ensured that the quality of the service, the public services that they need to be delivered, has gone down. TTIP will be far worse than that, because of failure, as we've already heard, to comply with their requirements under the agreement would challenge democratically elected governments in bodies that would actually adjudicate behind closed doors, as we've already heard from John, in the way that actually corporate entities will be able to sue democratically elected companies. And they will be able to dictate to our elected representatives the way that the services are delivered, or face massive compensation bills for future loss of profits. And I want to make it clear tonight, whilst we are opposing TTIP in its entirety, it is not because we're doing this from some little Englander perspective. We're not doing this because we want to keep the barriers up. History teaches us that protectionist barriers in times of recession are as dangerous as unfettered free trade. However, what TTIP does is brings into sharp relief the democratic deficit that is at the heart of the global economy. Just this week, sadly, I spent far too much time dealing with the consequences of the democratic deficit at the heart of the global economy. Goodyear and Wolverhampton, I'm sure you'll be well aware, their board in Ohio, thousands of miles away, took the decision to make 330 people in Wolverhampton redundant. And to add insult to injury, as if that plant that has been there since 1898, with all of the skills that are there, the fact that we know it's not the productivity, we know it's not the cost of running it, we just know it's easier and cheaper and quicker to do it here in the UK to close it than elsewhere in Europe. But to add insult to injury to the fact that we know it's not the commitment of the workforce in Wolverhampton, their suggestion to them is that we'll close your plant in Wolverhampton, but offer you jobs in Mexico. This clearly shows, it demonstrates the gap in reality between those making corporate decisions and understanding the lives of ordinary working people. As with TTIP, it exposes the truth that without democratic accountability in the boardroom or in trade negotiations, then we cannot trust those involved to act responsibly. This is why we have to mobilise the opposition, not just here in the UK, but right across Europe. Our sister confederations across Europe, as we've heard, are supporting the opposition to TTIP. In Germany, the DGB, which is the equivalent of the TUC, has called for demonstrations on the street in opposition to TTIP. And the Unite has been constantly raising the impact on the health service, in the knowledge that the international trade agreement tends to make most people glaze over if you start talking in detail about it. But as tonight demonstrates, there is a thirst for knowledge about the impact of TTIP. We must continue to flag up the issues as they impact on working people, demand greater openness, demand transparency in the process, and ultimately, people who are affected by this should have their voice heard, not faceless bureaucrats operating in secret in the EU or US. And that's why it's important we continue to campaign hard on this issue. Thanks very much for listening.
The speakers are just giving you their starter, but you may also want to know more. Now, we're going to 1 minute rule for questions. This is, if we were in rules, it would be a really succinct question and get a better answer, and I think people will be really liking you for asking a short question as well. So I'll have stopwatch. That's right. So, the stopwatch started, or about to be started. Who wants to ask the first question? Yes, Jack.
I'm a very proud NHS worker. Partly I'd like to say, any phonings or local papers, get on those phonings, get letters written, get TTIP out there. But I'd like to ask the board, what more can we do to get the ETUC on board with the rest of the UK trade unions, and what more can we do to get the MEPs to listen to the voices of the European citizens, including those of the United Kingdom?
Great question. Thank you. So who wants to take that?
Well, there's perhaps I better put the, it's easier, I'll bring the mic forward. I mean, clearly, because the 4-year, I'm trying to work out what a 4-year cycle would be. I know what a biennial conference takes place, and when a triennial conference.
The quadrennial.
In the quadrennial, okay. Well, I'll go to greater knowledge on the panel, but we're never so close on this 4-year cycle. Clearly, it is going to be left up to the representatives of the national unions at a very senior level, working through the senior officials of the TUC to put the maximum pressure on the ETUC. It is somewhat disappointing, to say the least, when the affiliate confederations are clearly against this, that they haven't listened to it. Normally the process obviously would have been motions and raising that formally through the TUC and onward up to the ETUC. But I don't think it hurts to use the power of social media these days to make sure that those representatives are aware of the feeling of ordinary trade unionists right across the European community. And of course the ability to ping an email off, or to make sure that you're making your voice heard through social media at the moment, I think because of the tightness of time, is still a very, very valuable resource, and we should use all of that.
Okay, on that basis, who would ping an email off to?
I knew as soon as I said that. I'm sure because we have the email addresses of everybody here today, we'll be able to circulate that up afterwards and make sure that you take up the opportunity to get that information so that you can act on it now.
Okay, next question.
Sorry, we've got roving microphones. Yeah. So, look there, yeah.
Thank you. Recently I've been privileged to attend a number of conferences while unite, and I've raised the question of TTIP. Now, in the majority of cases, including Keele University last weekend, it would appear to me that 8 out of 10 people know nothing of TTIP. So I'd like to join Martin perhaps in considering that a blanket drop. And I'm thinking down the lines that, okay, we'll have to be in this room this evening. But if we went away and just lived it in our own street, which was followed up then by perhaps a demonstration outside a supermarket or a market store, because the way I see this is our last chance to save one of our prize assets. So I'm asking the committee to consider going down that route, please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Shall we back there? Yes, it was on.
Yeah, Gerard, you mentioned about DGB trade union movement in Germany are planning to hold some sort of demonstrations against TTIP. Just want to put a question to you and any other person, perhaps in this room from other trade unions, perhaps. Whether we could possibly have our own sort of anti-TTIP protest demonstration in the city or across the region in terms of our fight against TTIP, but also against the Tory government and the austerity cuts as well.
I know that was directed at me, but I think John's probably got more up-to-date information on it.
Well, just to jump in before, the good news is there's a stack of stuff coming up on TTIP. The German demonstrations which are being planned are all meant to take place on the 10th of October. 10th of October is the International Day of Action against TTIP, and so we really call everybody out, and there are already events which are being planned up and down the country here. But of course for us, there's a pressing need that the Conservative Party is meeting for its annual conference in Manchester. As I'm sure everybody in this room is aware that there's a massive demonstration being called by the TTIP, which we're all going up to for the 4th of October, which is the Sunday when they start the Tory conference. But I'm also proud to be part of the People's Assembly Against Austerity, along with representatives of the Unite Central Office, and we have decided to hold a week of actions from the 4th all the way to the 10th. So we're starting with the big demo in Manchester on the 4th. On the 5th, we're holding a rally, both in the morning outside the town hall in Manchester, and then in the evening. You can get up from Birmingham to Manchester for the evening. We're going to have speakers addressing the whole issue of how we reclaim Europe and defeat TTIP. So there's going to be a range of things all the way through until the 10th, and again there'll be a series of different events across the country. It'd be fantastic if there was a big one in Birmingham as well. So,
just by way of further information as well, that there are coaches being laid on, certainly for the protest that's taking place on the 4th of October up in Manchester. We still, I know, have spaces available on the Unite coaches that are going up there, so if anybody is interested in going along and joining us in protesting up at Manchester, then people waving their hands over there are the ones that you should see afterwards. There's no charge, I hasten to add, the seats are free, and the more the merrier, so anybody's welcome to come along. So those two people over there are the people to see.
Next speaker's challenge the room time and the time. Red time. Red time.
The main topic was Hilary mentioned in his introduction there about the trade agreement. Is this a treaty change as well? Because if so, some of the states in the European Union have written constitutions and have to go to a referendum. What's the situation in places like Germany and some Ireland and some other countries where they have to consult the national populations before proceeding? I just want to be clear on that one. And the second point is, what about the role of the commissioners where the real power lies, not so much in the European Parliament? What is their stance?
Yeah, I'll take that. I can take that. It's institutional. So yeah. So essentially, it's not a treaty change of the EU treaties. It's an international agreement, right? So the way it works is that depending on whether it's considered to be shared competence between the EU and the member states or not, and likely it will be because for political reasons as well as for legal reasons. What happens is that you have to have a majority of MEPs vote in favour. You have to have the Council of Ministers, so that's the body where all EU member states are represented, vote unanimously in favour, and you also need the individual national parliaments of the member states to ratify it. However, you can provisionally apply the agreement before the ratification by the European Parliament or the member state parliaments has taken place, which, of course, politically, is very difficult. I think with an agreement that's this contentious, and that's of course important. That's why it's important to keep up the pressure. But yeah, the Commission has a lot of power in this area because A, the member states haven't really been negotiating trade agreements for a while, so of course a lot of the expertise is at the Commission level. And B, of course, they're the ones who set the agenda and put forward a mandate and are the ones who follow this on a daily basis, even if they are subject to certain checks and balances. So yeah, I don't know whether you want to add something to that, John.
If I may just add one tiny thing, there is some work being done across Europe to look at those countries like the Netherlands as well as Ireland and Germany, where there is a prima facie clash between what TTIP will be given to corporations and the democratic rights of a sovereign government. So they are doing that work. But let's not kid ourselves. Remember, when it came to the Lisbon Treaty, there was one country which was offered a referendum. That country was Ireland. And the people of Ireland voted no. And then they were told, it wasn't a referendum, it was a test. And you got the wrong answer. So you resit the test. And so the second time when they had the referendum, they voted yes. Now at the playground, you'd have had the best of three at least, 2-1 all. But no, they said that was the correct answer, and now it's going through. So we needn't trust in any of the institutions of the European Union. And this, Gerard completely correctly said the democratic deficit at the heart of the global economy. We're also now peering deeply into the democratic deficit at the heart of the European Union. And if you're looking at a referendum, we have it coming.
Let me do that with the long hair. Where's Remy Mike?
That's all right in the middle.
Did you have done that? Second row.
this one?
And they have to be election of German Corbyn in effect.
What do I do? I get the feeling that Jeremy has made his position very clear. I also get the feeling that this is something he'd be unequivocal about. There wouldn't be any shuffling from one foot to the other. In fact, one of the things I'd love to do is to see him in Birmingham, and certainly once in the cities, as soon as we can get him, when everybody's after him. But as soon as we can get him, in order to make this position quite clear. If you have a leadership in the Labour Party which is very clear, very straightforward, and it is very much to do with the rights of working people, and I get the feeling that's exactly what Jeremy stands for. It's got to say something, just as his candidature has said something very, very, very strong. And you know, the most wonderful thing about that, particularly to young people, who have actually been swept along by the fact that here is somebody who speaks his mind, here is somebody who has a mind, here is somebody who has a soul, here's somebody who's not sold his soul, but here's somebody who's prepared to be articulate about exactly what he believes, what his standards are. And one of the interesting things about this new leader of the Labour Party, and I haven't heard this word for a long time, decency is the word that's most used about him. And I think he sometimes used that word himself in terms of the relationships with people. And of course, Question Time probably exemplified exactly what he meant by this. But I think the standards and the quality and the values are very, very clear from the leadership. I don't quite know what's going to come out of the conference because it's not happened yet. But what a leadership and what a stand.
Just for information, the policy of the Labour Party in July 2014 was that we support the principle of TTIP, but we will not support it if it puts in jeopardy the NHS and other public services. We will also not support it unless ISDS or any other alternative dispute resolution is removed or diluted to exclude all public policy issues. We're also of the view that it has to be much more transparent and be geared to benefiting consumers and SMEs. I hope that's helpful. And that was Ian Murray, the Shadow Trade Secretary. So that was the position that we thought the Labour Party, we told the Labour Party was in when we were campaigning within the Labour Party until then.
Just one tiny addition, if I may. Yesterday, you may have seen that Gerard Coyne was interviewed by Jon Snow on Channel 4 News, and he actually spoke out there and said we would have no interest in Europe with the TTIP involved. So that's his statement. And John McDonnell, the day before, was the Shadow Chancellor. He said we want nothing to do with TTIP. But exactly as Martin's saying, what does that mean when it clashes with the rest of the party to wait and see?
Yeah, I think also just to sort of add on to that, my understanding is also he's come out today saying that we'll be campaigning for Britain to stay in Europe during the referendum. But my take on that is actually that is even more of a golden opportunity to be flagging up the issues in relation to TTIP, because the reason for wanting to campaign to stay in Europe is to ensure that you change from within those workers' rights and regulations that are so dear to us in this room, one of those being opposition to TTIP. So I actually think that takes us a step forward to making sure that this is more on the agenda.
Chat there with the strongly drinker and the beard. Wandering microphone, come on.
Just to ask that if TTIP it does go through, is there only choice left to leave the EU?
Which one first?
Yeah,
that's the point.
I mean, I think it's important to distinguish the two issues insofar as leaving the EU would not preclude a TTIP-like agreement. In fact, certainly the current government would be very keen on its own free trade agreement with the United States. And there, of course, you would have less countervailing forces against things like deregulation and locking in of privatisation, because the current government is very, very much committed to that. Not only that, because Britain's leverage in negotiations would be far lower than that of the European Union. So I think it's important to recognise that leaving the European Union when it comes to TTIP is not a panacea, I think, at least from my perspective.
I agree, but supposing the TTIP vote goes first, supposing when we have the referendum...
But you would still be subject to certain requirements. There's particularly for investment protection clauses, often sunset clauses, which mean that investment protections, span beyond the life of the agreement, even if it were terminated.
Just to say there is no possibility of TTIP having been concluded and ratified before the referendum. It will take at least, once they finish the negotiations, it will take a period of at least another year and a half, 2 years for it to go through ratification. So we will have the referendum in advance. But I slightly disagree with Gabriel. I think this goes to the point of the Commission. It's not just the member states of Europe involved here. It is an unelected, unaccountable Commission which has its own agenda. And it's the institutions of the European Union which are the problem here. Now, unless you've got a way of completely reinventing the institutions of the European Union, then you've got no way out. And that's what the Greek people have found on the receiving end of the ECB. It's what workers have found on the receiving end of the European Court of Justice in all the cases which have eroded workers' rights. Europe used to be a balance between the social rights and the rights of capital. And that balance is being eroded and eroded and eroded. So now what we're being presented with more and more are the institutions of the European Union trying to do the business of capital against working people. And that, I think, is putting it into irrespective of what you think about it being in or out, it's putting it into a starker perspective than it was before.
Okay, look at the next speaker over there in the purple jumper.
Thank you very much. I found it really interesting so far in describing the opportunities TTIP presents for cherry picking health services, and particularly more profitable ones to go to corporations, etc. What I haven't heard about seen much of, and I wonder if there's been any moral consideration of, is the impact TTIP will have also on the supply of health workforce, particularly around the engagement of higher education and the way there are signs that in the way that maybe American university corporations can also cherry pick that, and the fees, etc. Has there been anyone to look at that? And is there data there?
Yeah, there has been. We've brought some leaflets about the education impact, which are at the back on the table right up by the wall. And they, again, have been signed up with all of the different trade unions in this country who are involved in the education sector. Education at all levels, primary, secondary, higher education, they're all in CITES. We've seen the offer which has been made by the European Union to open those up irreversibly. So we know that's already gone in there. And groups like ETUCE, which is the European Education Federation of Trade Unions, have just shifted their position. Their position used to be on TTIP that they wanted to get education out because they were so scared about it. Now they recognise that that's not the answer, so they've changed their position to one of total opposition. So it's not just the national federations of trade unions which are dead against it, but also the global union federations at the European level are also coming out against it. And the UCU has done studies, and they've got a UCU position paper looking on the impact on further and higher education in this country, which is available from their website as well. So yeah, the education unions are doing a lot on this, and also spreading the word about it as well.
So you've all outlined how worrying it is that this agreement has had such a lack of public scrutiny and such a democratic involvement. So have any proposals for future reforms been put forward by any groups or organisations so something like this doesn't happen in the future?
Yeah, I mean, there's something called the alternative trade mandate, which I think was the organisation involved in producing that. And I mean, the problem is in the sense that that's in some ways very general and very broad, right? So it's about statements of principle. I mean, one thing I would say is it's important that this movement on TTIP or this activism on TTIP doesn't end here with the defeat of TTIP, insofar as that and then just fizzles out, right? It's important that all this momentum is put into something more, as you say, more constructive. And, I think it's time to start thinking about things like, well, can we shift the debate about trade away from trade equals deregulation, trade equals let's see regulation as an irritant to free exchange, and maybe make trade about things like improving labour standards and improving environmental standards. Unfortunately, the debate is not very much about that, and you saw with the sustainability, the sustainable development chapter that I think was alluded to in Gerard's speech. That this is sort of a fairly low priority for the negotiations, and this is actually where ETUC it has a somewhat ambiguous position, right? Which was very much criticised, and I think the reason it takes that position, rightly or wrongly, is because it wants to shape that sustainability chapter. So the question is, can you push for something more desirable in the future? And as it stands, I think it's very difficult because the balance of forces is such. But it'd be a pity if all the momentum just fizzled out with the TTIP. That would be a pity.
Yeah, I think it's quite important to understand that there's two elements here. I talked about the democratic deficit, and that isn't just in relation to, as John has said quite rightly, in Europe. It's about addressing an issue that has been bubbling below the scenes for about the past 20 to 30 years as globalisation has taken place and decisions are actually being taken right across the world that impact on local communities without any redress or any form of showing your anger at that without a democratic process alongside it. And there is a big issue about how over the process of the Industrial Revolution the democratic structures sat alongside addressing excesses in capitalism. So you saw in the sort of 19th century the growth of municipal responses to clean up towns, and they were democratic organisations that here in Birmingham we have lots of history of in terms of the principles that were laid down of municipal engagement. That then shifted in the 20th century into nation-state responses to it. The big question is the 21st century about a global response to how capital is now organising itself and how the people's voice of the world gets heard in that context. That sounds all up there, right in the air, but until we start to grapple with that, we won't address what is going on in those negotiations. We will piecemeal, find a solution. And part of the debate between the US and the EU is that the swing in the pendulum has moved away from a social Europe. But it has done that previously. When, in 1992, the first coming together of the open market creation, a lot of people at the time predicted that would be a boss's market, that it would only be about deregulation, about cutting standards across Europe. And for a quite surprising period of time, during the 90s, with the right influence, the right pressure, actually we saw lots of positive things coming out in protection of workers' rights in the EU, not just in health and safety, but also in terms of positive steps around engagement, European Works Councils, consultation mechanisms, information mechanisms. We've just got to grab that agenda back. And not just do it at a European level, we've got to do it on a global level.
Yeah. Just addressing some of the things that have just been said, including Gerard just now.
He's better without, honestly.
He was loud enough.
It is.
Thank you. In terms of what Gerard was just saying, and John and Gabriel there, the positives in the 90s were funded by an upswing in the global economy, which for the most part was a result of deregulation, Russia and China and the expansion of markets in the old communist world. We have no old communist world to expand into. Now we borrow from the future on credit, and the only way now that the bosses can continue their rise in profits is by driving down standards, and this is what TTIP is about. And we can defeat TTIP. They'll keep on trying to deregulate. The democratic deficit doesn't just exist in Europe or through in terms of TTIP negotiations. It exists right here. We've seen the total disregard of democratic structures, the undermining of trade unions. So is it not the case that actually we need to fight the expansion of profits that we, the 99%, need to understand that we can't control what we don't own, and if we don't take back control of it, and don't take back ownership of it, then this is what we have. We will have acid wash meat on in our market stores as opposed to the rotten meat they had in Victorian England. I said, is it not closed?
Let it from there.
Jackie Lowe, United Member, Land. Thank you all for talking to us, because I think it's clarified some of the issues for me. But it's made me think that we, as a society, have lost our moral compass, and I think we can trace it back. I hate to mention the T word, but to the Thatcherians. And then I hate to mention the B word, but then continued. And I fear that the loss of trade union rights and democracies that started with the T word and continued with the B word, and then moving on with the C word, has not been very helpful to us. And I would ask the panel what their views are in terms of TTIP is a very big thing for us to fight. I can't see how we can win anything without a powerful trade union movement. So I would argue and ask for advice on how on earth do we mobilise to defeat the new trade union legislation that's been proposed as well. Because I think they go hand in glove. I appreciate your views on that.
I'll kick off on this. I mean, there is no doubt that the proposals as were put on Monday had the effect of unifying the whole of the Labour MPs and the rest of the Labour movement in terms of what the Tories are now doing, which is vicious and vindictive. There is no other way of describing it. The reality is there is no evidence to suggest that there is needed further legislation in this field. You know, umpteen independent organisations have said this. The Institute of Professional Development that oversees HR professionals has also come out and said, we do not believe there's any need for this legislation, there is no evidence. Their spokesperson was on the radio on Monday making that case. So we you know that this is just a deliberate attack, not just on the trade union movement, but on the ability for us to have a political voice and for us to articulate an alternative vision and to also support clearly in terms of the attack on the political fund in the main for most affiliate trade unions, the Labour Party. It's as simple as that. And you take this in the round of other things. I mean, obviously I can talk for the rest of the evening with passion about the impact it will have on our members, the attack on terms and conditions that are going to come, the fact that it will drive down workers' pay, and you know the abuses that are already there that workers are having to endure, and the lack of protection that will be eroded as a result of this bill. But you take that in the context of other things that are going on, like what they're proposing around voter registration and put in place around voter registration, and what's going on in terms of the boundary reviews. And this is about ensuring that the 21st century is a Tory decade. No doubt about that. They are gerrymandering the constituencies to make sure that there will never be the opportunity for Labour to get re-elected again. And they are attacking the funding of the Labour Party to make sure that equally there is not the resource to provide that voice. So, you know, to a degree, you've got to give it to them, haven't you? They get elected on a so-called centre ground ticket, and then they revert to top. And it's exactly what Thatcher did, except she, you know, this lot have gone worse, have done more than she did in the 90s, and now they are deliberately just sticking the boot in. And you could get very depressed and very down and, you know, go away and sort of sit in a corner and think it's never going to go away. Well, the reality is, you know, it's the old maxims of the trade union movement. You've got to organise. And that is what we have to do, educate and organise people as to, one, the vindictive nature of this. People understand that in this very difficult time where people, many people are suffering as a result of austerity, that actually there have been very few people, very few voices speaking up for them, but one of them has been the trade union. They understand that actually there is a need in civic society, in a democratic society, for people to have the right to join a trade union, for them to take what every other international ILO standard, European standard accepts, that lawful democratic strike action is a fundamental human right. Now that is under threat in this country, and we've got to stand up for our human rights in the same way as I touched on in my speech, in exactly our forebears, our forefathers, our foremothers stood up against fascism in the 40s and 30s and 40s. We've now got to stand up for fundamental human rights, sadly, at home.
Yeah, I think just to reiterate what a lot of speakers are saying, maybe given my academic bent, but in hopefully a jargon-free language. I think the really interesting thing from my perspective about TTIP, and as someone who's looked at previous trade agreements, is that, for, in some ways, not the first time, but for, in an unprecedented level, this is not being framed by those critical of the agreement as sort of something about economic gains, and I think this is really important. In the past, those who were critical of trade agreements were, just labeled as protectionist. You're just a special interest. You just care about your own wages to the detriment of all the consumers and everyone else who benefits from trade liberalisation. And what's been very successful here is that this has been framed, and rightly so, as a debate about values. What we academics would call something normative. Right? So that's what it's all about. You've heard it today. This is about something that's potentially a threat to democratic decision making, public services, etc. And that sort of framing is really what's driving the sort of public campaign about it. And that's I think what needs to that's where the pressure comes from.
Just wanted to clarify, you mentioned about democratic decision making, about how TTIP they can override government decisions. Yet you've already said that that's already happening in Germany, it's been mentioned in Romania. How is that taking place if that's not actually been ratified yet?
Yeah, it's a very good point. The way in which it's happened in those countries is through other treaties. So in Germany, it's the result of the Energy Charter Treaty, which is something which came in the 1990s, which just refers to the energy sector. But it's also happened in lots of other countries in bilateral investment treaties. The key thing about this one is that it would open it up to US corporations to sue every single European country. And what we haven't even talked about yet is a previous deal, EU-Canada deal, called CETA, Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, which they've already finished the negotiations for back last year, and is going through slowly a process of ratification. It's like TTIP's younger brother, if you want, and just as nasty, because it will introduce the same principle of these investment courts. And, of course, 80% of US companies have got offices in Canada. So they can come straight in and start using that agreement as you, and that's the one which is going to go before the European Parliament next year first. So if you want to get in touch again, what people are saying, putting more pressure on MEPs and things like that, also we need to be holding their feet to the fire in relation to this Canada deal, which is going to come pretty soon.
Speaker? There's a question.
Yeah, well, I'm Stuart Simon, Treasurer of the Birmingham Education Council, and I'd also like to congratulate the organisers, essentially united officials, for organising this impressive conversation. We work very closely with them in the Birmingham Trades Council Economic Committee and have done a number of campaigns. Just on the lady's point there, we are holding a public protest on Tuesday at 5 o'clock for return against the union laws related to the TV. But I just wanted to ask a question in relation particularly to Gerard's point about, I agree with him very much that we need to have transparency and have open information for the public, But he also said, and he also developed this later, we need democratic accountability of boardrooms. I think I agree with John MacDonald. That's not possible in the framework of capitalism. You know, capitalism is organising the system, carrying them through a very small number of people. And so,
Shut up.
my question is how you can have that direct accountability with the framework of private ownership of most of capital, which is very narrowly owned by a small section of population.
Before anybody answers, we're going to finish this meeting about 8:30 because our speakers
Speakers have to go, because one of the team has to go. So we're just going to try and be snappy about it.
Yeah. So I'll ask the 3 questions, then you can...
And then we'll answer them. So quick question.
Pop your one on.
Yeah, 12 months ago I sat on the fence advertising the reason being I'm working in the automotive industry, but as Gabriel was pointed out, it's about 3% in trading tariffs against privatising the NHS, so it was a no-brainer. But the question I'm going to ask to the panel is, because I like the devil is in the detail, until I looked into the detail, is, you know, and the amount of work people are doing now, even the shower that's in charge now, are talking to the unions, the wording to protect the NHS. So what's your thoughts on that?
Third question, then we can answer it in a block. That's it, no more questions.
Yeah, when you're talking about globalisation, I think in economic sense, there's globalisation is only America and the EU. How you can link with the third world, and they're trying to also coming up, and there's no link from ILO even, no link from trade unions from Western side to especially in Southeast Asia as a continent, and they have tried also BRIC and standing against IMF. How you can link that?
One final one.
Catherine Maguire, Green Party Stourbridge. Our local Tory MP defends TTIP on the grounds that it will bring a lot of new jobs to our town and surrounding areas. I would like the panel's view on how to best to dismantle and counter that argument, please.
Okay, excellent question. So, we'll take one of them down.
Oh, yeah. Let me tell you one about the rest of the world, because no one really talks about that yet. And I think I want to link this to the question around not just capitalism and the inexhaustible desire of capital to expand beyond all limits, but also imperialism. Because again, this is absolutely the heart of TTIP, is trying to rescue the European Union and the US from the decline in their power, which they see being a long-term decline. If you think back even just to the period of the 1950s, the US and the EU together represented 75% of world economic output. Now it's shrunk down to 50% and it's going further down. And so they have said quite explicitly that TTIP is about trying to restore the power of the transatlantic alliance, and not just the power in terms of economics, but also military power. Because they've said, and I quote you this, that TTIP is the economic NATO. And that's when you recognise that they're using it particularly against Russia. And we haven't even talked about the energy bits of TTIP. TTIP is trying to unlock a massive flood of shale gas and tar sands oil from North America into Britain and to the rest of Europe. Why? Because that way you break dependence on Russian oil and gas, which isn't so huge for us here, but you go to the countries of Eastern Europe and they are absolutely scared beyond what you can imagine in this respect. Tanks are currently going down the eastern coast of the eastern side of Poland. American tanks, NATO tanks, going through the villages there in order to try and square up to Russia. And for the other countries of the emerging economies like Brazil, India, China, it's again an explicit reaction to their challenge. So the imperialist countervailing force of TTIP is another big, big thing. But just finally for me, I won't touch on the other ones because I know other people who deal with that. But the final thing is we've got the big climate change talks coming up at the end of this year in Paris, when the world is supposed to be trying to deal with the threats of climate change. even under the official statistics, which we sort of recognise in this book, even under the official statistics, TTIP will lead to a massive increase in greenhouse gases. And yet, the European Union still dares to call itself a leader in trying to combat climate change. It's exactly that sort of thing that we need to be able to flag up to people so that they can't have it both ways.
Okay, for the lady wants evidence about to answer her MP.
Yeah. So, well, I've got a voucher here for the book, which I'll give to you. But no, jokes aside, although we do touch upon this argument in the book, in fact, I mean, if you look at the study that MPs and those who are advocates of TTIP will want to cite, they're talking about extra GDP gains of £400 per person, for a family of 4 per year, right, which is not very much. And also, those statistics are vastly exaggerating the impact of TTIP because they rely on statistics on the degree to which non-tariff barriers to trade actually add costs to businesses, which are taken from business surveys, right? And businesses, of course, have an interest in exaggerating the extent to which those barriers actually. Simple argument. Well, it's that trade barriers are not that significant between the EU and the US. And jobs. So, the fact that trade barriers are not that significant means that the benefits in terms of generating new jobs from eliminating those barriers are rather small and come at the expense, potentially, of hard-won social and environmental protections, right? So it's the fact that, those barriers are not that significant. Therefore, eliminating them doesn't actually generate that much in terms of efficiency, and therefore doesn't generate that much in terms of jobs. It's as simple as that.
Just maybe one more time in the same way. We have a paper, I've got one left, so I'll give it to you on the way out, which looks into the official estimates as to 1 million jobs being lost as a result. So you can get the chapter reverse from this as well, which is a joint thing between us and all the trade unions. Although this is the only paper copy, it is available on the website.
And actually, there's quite a lot online if you just Google TTIP. There's some quite useful stuff, including a paper that's commissioned by Viz. Okay, not time. But there's this document. Have a copy of this. This has actually got some good stuff in it which you'll be able to extract some really good arguments which your MP won't be able to answer, I can assure you. Okay, and the other questions that were asked?
Can I just pick up that last one? The proof of the pudding is in the eating, and the NAFTA trade agreement, the stats on that was that 1 million jobs were lost in the US over 12 years as a result of the North American Free Trade Agreement. So if they say it's going to create jobs, actually the experience in North America is that they lost jobs in the US as a result of that 1 million jobs over 12 years. I think in terms of, I was disappeared now, I wasn't going to engage in a debate about the evolutionary road to socialism or the revolutionary road. I think for tonight we need to focus on the issue at hand, obviously, in relation to TTIP. And I think there is an issue actually that was raised here about the focus of a number of our campaigns has been about the importance of the NHS in this. And of course we've heard over this evening, and that's why we're holding these events, is that it affects a whole host of things, not just public services. It affects the environment, it affects education, it affects such a plethora of environmental standards and consumer standards alongside it, that actually what we don't want is, if they do agree to take the NHS out of TTIP, that the wind goes out of the sails in opposition to the other elements of it. And of course, as I said earlier, it was inevitable that on a fairly dry subject, with the respect to the eminent people on this panel who spend a lot of time studying it, on a fairly dry subject, trying to get it over in a context to people in the street, then obviously we did focus on the NHS, but there has to be now a transition to understanding the full impact. And I think also there is some valuable mileage in that consumer side, because I do think there's an attempt to try and paint us as just sort of producer interest, that trade unions would say that because it's attacking terms and conditions and workers' rights. Well, no, actually it means that the quality of the food that you're eating you can't guarantee. It means that actually people are open to choices that they don't know have already been made in the US about GM and other things like that. And I do think we've got to broaden this so that people understand It's not just about their working conditions or what might happen to their public sector or public services. It's about the very food that they put in their mouths that could be affected as a result of this. And the final thing in relation to the international reach of trade unionism, this obviously does happen under the respective centres. The ICFTU obviously is the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions, and they are the overseeing international body. There are others, but I do agree that actually in terms of individual union to union contact, we've started it in Unite in relation to a partnership working arrangement with the United Steelworkers in the US. It does need to go further, and it doesn't just need to be between the developed world. It has got to reach out to exploited workers in the rest of the world to make sure that the comradely traditions of fraternity extend to organising and assisting. Because supply chains, funny enough, I was listening to a programme this morning, and this is at an advanced manufacturing level about Boeing in Seattle, and the supply chains for Boeing. There are over 6 million parts sourced right across the world in a Dreamliner that they're producing at the moment. Undoubtedly, some of that will be done in countries where exploitation and labour standards are appalling. We've got to start at the top of the supply chain and drive those standards through as organised labour, because it's only in the long term going to undercut, because they will outsource and push work along those supply chain lines to cheaper and cheaper and cheaper alternatives. And unless we reach out into the rest of the world as organised labour to do it, then inevitably it will undercut our terms and conditions.
If I can respond to the person from the automotive industry, I was talking to somebody also from the automotive industry and engineering renegotiating standards, and I was talking to him about TTIP. He was appalled at the idea that the standards that have been negotiated to improve engine performance, for example, and reduce emissions might just be eliminated. So there's a lot of people in the automotive industry who think those standards actually improved our competitiveness and actually improved European car industry performance generally and made it more innovative and prosperous. So there are things about regulation that that actually improve the product and improve the technology. So TTIP could actually threaten some of the advances that we've made. Okay, now I think we've come to the end of our time now, so I'd just like to thank all of you for coming, taking the time to come here on a Thursday night, and that's our speakers in particular have come a long way to get here. So Gabriel Siles-Brugge, thank you very much. John Hilary is going to get here. Who studied so admirably for Jess Phillips and also paid tribute to Jess and the good things she's been doing. Gerard Coyne coming here and speaking for Unite. Also the organisers, People's NHS West Midlands organised the event, but it was supported by Unite the Union. It's essentially Unite the Union people who've been here, getting everything ready, getting the whole thing organised, nagging everyone to come, putting stuff out. And so to Martin. Martin's also been, a lot of people have been putting information out about this and getting people here. So thank you all for all of that. Now, you've got with you've got an information pack, you've listened to these debates. Labour there was concerned about the trade unions being attacked and being the only thing that could actually help defeat TTIP. Actually, we've all got friends, we've got family, we've got loads of people who actually need to know about this and be affected by it. So our task is to go out with this information and talk knowledgeably about what's been going on. To your work, your friends, your neighbours, the people in the pub, we meet in the shops. They've got to be engaged about TTIP in everyday conversations. So it's no longer a secret and it's something they're all attuned to. And then we've got the various demonstrations which are much more sort of community-based, which will also get people aware of it. So we've got to keep people talking about it. We've also got to think what the lady there was saying, we've got to actually do something about the organisations in Europe to say, we don't like this way of doing things. So we've got to think, what would a good organisation look like? What would a good trade deal look like? Also, what would a good European organisation look So we've got to do some thinking about what that would look like and put our demands to our MEPs and to anyone and to our government to say, this is what we want to negotiate on Europe, this is what we want in the negotiations on Europe, we want it to be more democratic. So when it comes to the referendum,